Dr. Renuka started her career with a BBS degree from BJ Medical College, Pune. Then she did a post-graduation in pathology from St. John's Medical College. She is now director of CDL and CRICR, and she is also chairperson of the trust. And she has also successfully conducted International Dermopathology Conference. Dr. Renuka, please.
As we have just, both of them, the chairperson and the previous speaker has said, that what is required for a diagnosis of a vasculitis is a very strong clinical suspicion. Only when you have a strong suspicion, then you need to go into a systematic way, and it is very important for us to diagnose vasculitis because it's a heterogeneous group of disorder. It is not a single disorder. It can affect any vessel in the body and hence has a varied clinical presentation. Vasculitis is defined as a clinical pathologic process which is characterized by inflammation and damage to vessel wall, which can involve any vessel. So it may lead to increase in the vascular permeability, which causes weakening of the vessel wall and aneurysm formation or hemorrhage, or it could lead to intimal proliferation and thrombosis. That results in local ischemia and obstruction. What I would do is here, basically I'll give a simple approach of how to go about diagnosing vasculitis, how to differentiate, so that if possible, sometimes I said though we may not be able to differentiate, at least we can classify into a group whether it is what is the extent of the disease, how aggressive they need to be is what will be helpful. So what you need to look at is to determine what kind of vessel is involved, predominantly involved, and this is based on the clinical presentation, and this also forms the basis of classification for most of in this vasculitis, to identify the cause of the disease and to rule out the other causes of secondary vasculitis, and to determine the extent of the disease with imaging and lab parameters. Most of the workup goes basically into identifying the causes of secondary vasculitis and ruling it out actually, and finally to confirm with a biopsy and classify the disease. To determine what is the kind of vasculitis, basically vasculitis, this is already a picture which has been put up, that it's basically classified into large vessel vasculitis, medium sized vasculitis, as well as small vessel vasculitis. The large vessels are giant cell arteritis, Takayasu's arteritis. The medium vessel vasculitis are polyarteritis nodosa and Kawasaki disease. And the small vessel vasculitis, which cover up Wegener's granulomatosis, microscopic polyangiitis, Henoch-Schönlein purpura, cutaneous leukocytic angiitis, and so on. But if you look at this picture, when we say large vessel vasculitis, it affects not just the large vessels, some of them also affect the medium vessels. Like it affects the medium sized arteries also in addition. And a polyarteritis nodosa and Kawasaki, it affects basically the medium sized arteries. And if you look particularly the small vessel vasculitis, it varies. It not only affects the small, look at the Wegener's granulomatosis. It affects as well as the medium sized arteries, venules, veins, capillaries, all the blood vessels may be involved. So what I mean to say is, usually though we classify in this basis, you don't have to specifically, you can't say, okay, if it's affecting a larger vessel, it's affecting a medium sized vessel, it might not possibly a Wegener's vasculitis as well as medium sized vessel vasculitis as well as the renal manifestations. Whereas the medium sized vasculitis usually affects the GIT, and the large vessel vasculitis present with neurologic, sometimes also with small arteries. But there are a few clinical features which will help us to think, there are some clues which we have to take into which kind of a vessel is involved when we are classifying, thinking of what kind of a vasculitis it is. The major part of the laboratory goes into identifying the cause of the disease and to rule out other causes of secondary vasculitis, and as well as to determine the extent of the disease. These two things, I'll discuss them together. This is again the classification of vasculitis. What we said, the earlier vasculitis were all primary vasculitis, but then there are multiple secondary causes such as infections, hepatitis B, drugs, and sometimes malignancies, in addition to a lot of vasculitis mimicus, which Dr. Chandrasekhar has already discussed. Most of these vasculitis are mediated, the primary vasculitis are mediated by immunopathogenic mechanisms. And like they represent the 4 hypersensitivity reactions. Like allergic angiitis is seen with Churg-Strauss, which is characterized by eosinophilia and elevated Ig levels. Antibody mediated vasculitis, which example of which is a Wegener's or a microscopic polyangiitis, which do not have much of immune complex depositions, but they have low complement levels sometimes. They are actually posse-immune, and immune complex vasculitis are the ones which have low complement levels, and they are usually associated with immune complex deposits. And the T-cell mediated hypersensitivities, such as the granulomatous arthritis or the temporal arthritis. So this forms the pathogenic classification. So earlier there were a lot of classifications which are based just on this vasculitis, and it also gives a clue as to how do you proceed in this way. First and foremost, a CBC with CRP, which includes ESR, CBC with ESR and CRP is required in most of the cases of vasculitis. Leukocytosis, anemia of chronic diseases, and increased ESR and increased CRP are present in most of the cases of vasculitis, though a normal ESR doesn't mean that you should not consider it in your differential diagnosis. Another simple test which is usually required and very useful is a urine analysis and one serum creatinine levels and liver enzyme levels. These will evaluate for organ involvement. Just the presence of proteinuria and RBC casts usually indicate glomerulonephritis, which could be present in a case of vasculitis. Blood cultures will be done basically to rule out other infections like HIV, HBsAg, HCV. A chest X-ray may sometimes just help in revealing a asymptomatic pulmonary lesion. And in addition, depending on the presentation, if you feel the sinuses are involved, then yes, an X-ray of the sinus or a CT scan may help, particularly in a case of a Wegener's, which usually involves the ear, nose, throat. When neurological features are present or a patient gives a muscle weakness as a symptom, then CPK levels and ENMG studies will be helpful. Rheumatoid factor, though it can be present in many higher conditions, in many conditions it's usually very high in cases such as rheumatoid arthritis, Sjogren's, and cryoglobulinemia associated vasculitis. Anti-nuclear antibodies will help us in differentiating it from the other connective tissue disorders as well as the DNA. This will also help us. A test which is quite frequently asked in vasculitis is the complement levels such as C3, C4, CH50 studies. So here low complement levels, most of the vasculitis, some of them will have normal or high forms, but there are some classical features wherein low complements will be present in cryoglobulinemia, in hepatitis B and C associated vasculitis, and in lupus associated vasculitis. The cryoglobulins, though they are a must for a diagnosis of essential cryoglobulinemia, they might be present not only in cryoglobulinic vasculitis but could also be associated with other conditions such as lymphomas, plasma cell dyscrasias, chronic infections such as hepatitis B, C in endocarditis, and inflammatory rheumatic disorders such as Sjogren's, lupus, and rheumatoid arthritis. So these are the things which we come to some kind of a test which are more commonly asked, which we need to do to differentiate whether there is any kind of an organ involvement, to look into the different systems, and also to see that whether there could be a clue for it's a vasculitis. In addition, ANCA, that is anti-neutrophil cytoplasmic antibodies, are the test which is very commonly asked, particularly in the small vessel vasculitis. These can be done by the immunofluorescence method or by the ELISA method. Immunofluorescence method is the first one which is done, and is the first and foremost is what we do because we pick up at better, the sensitivity is better than the ELISAs. And here we get two patterns based on whether they are affecting based on the staining which occurs either in the cytoplasm or it is around the perinucleus. These will be basically against the antigens which are present in the cytoplasm of the neutrophils and sometimes of monocytes. The antibodies will react against the antigens which are present. The ones which are, this test ANCA should be asked only when you have a very strong clinical suspicion of vasculitis such as Wegener's, microscopic polyangiitis, and Churg-Strauss syndrome. These which might present with say pulmonary hemorrhage or recurrent sinusitis, orbital mass, or glomerulonephritis. These are the various patterns again here, and in addition, I'll just say that The ones which are in C. ANCA is most commonly associated with a PR3 antigen, and it is associated more commonly with vaginous granulomatosis, whereas if you see at MPO, it doesn't have a single antigen, but multiple antigens which are present, such as the myeloperoxidase, which is the most common, followed by the elastase, lactoferrin, cathepsin, lysozymes, beta-glucuronidase, and so many antibodies are present, which might be positive not only in microscopic cholangitis and vaginous, but also in other conditions like inflammatory bowel disease. Inflammatory bowel disease, we do use P. ANCA for one of the diagnostic, as a diagnostic test. Autoimmune rheumatic diseases, some forms of vasculitis. So what we do once ANCA is positive is, we try to see if there is, which is the antigen which is usually involved. To see for it, as I said, C. ANCA is usually associated with proteinase 3, that will confirm that the antigen is against proteinase 3, and this the sensitivity increases when you combine them together, and it will also help you to sometimes ignore the very not so important antigens which may be involved. And the ones which are associated with myeloperoxidase, usually the P. ANCA, and very close differential diagnosis sometimes when there is renal involvement is the Goodpasture's syndrome. So that is the reason why we also do a GBM antibody along with it to differentiate the vasculitis. ANCAs are of course not absolutely sensitive nor specific, and it can present in many other vasculitis, as I said. But when C. ANCA and P. ANCA coexist in a patient, a drug-induced vasculitis should be more like possibility. And estimation, the advantage of ANCA is once you do an ANCA, it will also help in disease monitoring. This is just a small DD of how to work up an ANCA-associated vasculitis. When a patient has pulmonary infiltrates or nodules, glomerular nephritis or upper airway disease along with ANCA, then you think in terms of a vaginous granulomatosis. If a patient has more of cutaneous manifestation with glomerular nephritis, then you think in terms of a microscopic polyangiitis. If there is associated pulmonary infiltrates with associated asthma the patient presents with, and he has eosinophilia, then and of course he might still have a ENT involvement and peripheral nervous system involvement particularly, then you should start thinking in terms of Churg-Strauss syndrome. And finally, diagnosis of a vasculitis is not complete without doing a biopsy. A biopsy is a must actually as per the criteria to do a diagnosis of vasculitis, though sometimes you can delay it by the use of other assays like ANCA. A histopathology confirmed biopsy is the gold standard for diagnosis, and the key criteria for morphological vasculitis workup includes to say what kind of a vessel is involved in the biopsy which we take, on the type of inflammation, and in the presence of the extra inflammatory changes. But what is more important when we do a biopsy is to take it from the right side, and to take only from where the organ involvement is present. We should not take a biopsy without a representative lesion, and it should also be taken at the proper time. The skin biopsy, this is the most common biopsy which is done in a workup of vasculitis. One is because it has a lot of cutaneous manifestations. Secondly, it is easily accessible, very the least non-invasive for us to do a skin biopsy. That is why this is the one which is done most frequently for a workup of vasculitis. The biopsy should not be delayed too long. It should be ideally be taken within 18 to 36 hours of the onset of lesions. And what is required when we take a biopsy is that you should show the complete lesion. So this is just to show a biopsy which is inadequate, basically because here it's only showing the epidermis and dermis, and there is no, it doesn't show the underlying subcutis. See here, if you see we find no vasculitis here, and I might just say though, no, there is just some non-specific inflammation. But when we get a deeper biopsy, a vessel involvement at junction of the subcutis and the dermis over here is the one which I would not miss if I get an appropriate biopsy. And though we classify vasculitis based on the vessel involvement, on morphology what we just see is basically that what is the kind of inflammatory infiltrate which is present, and we classify them as leukocytoclastic vasculitis, lymphocytic, eosinophilic, granulomatous, and giant cell arteritis. So giant cell vasculitis. So these are the way how we classify. I'll just take up, and these are the conditions which show which are associated with which kind of an inflammatory infiltrate. I won't go into the details of that. I'll just briefly show one image here of a leukocytoclastic vasculitis. This was actually a cutaneous pan. Diffuse cutis was a medium-sized arteriole which has got completely obliterated, and there is inflammatory infiltrate of both neutrophils and some lymphocytes are present which are, but most of them is neutrophils with lot of cellular fragments and debris which we call as leukocytoclasia. So this is a picture of a leukocytoclastic vasculitis in a cutaneous pan. Renal biopsy is also done quite frequently, basically because this is another very important site which is very commonly involved by kidney, particularly when you think that you see some RBC casts or proteins in the urine and there is a strong suspicion of vasculitis, we need to do that. Here small vessel vasculitis is more common compared to the medium and the large vessel vasculitis. This is just a picture to show an ANCA-associated vasculitis, wherein we see that here this is a renal glomerulus, and only a part of it, that is segmental necrotizing extracapillary glomerulitis, has occurred here, where there is a, if you see that whole thing has undergone necrosis, and there is a periglomerular inflammatory cell infiltrate which because of the rupture of the capsule, and there is a diffuse also interstitial inflammatory infiltrate over here. So if you do, and again an immunofluorescence is done on this, it will be either negative or scattered C3 granule, because as I said, these are usually posse-immune. However, there are a lot of pitfalls, because when we do in a histopathology, here we cannot diagnose exactly what kind of a vasculitis it is many times. We cannot classify it because we describe it more on the morphological terms, and it is not always, and these kind of inflammatory cells can be seen with other kinds of conditions also. But yes, it is very useful. And like when I say a renal vessel, when I say renal involvement, it is not actually a necrotizing vasculitis. It is basically a necrotizing glomerulonephritis that we see there. And they all tend to be focal, and when you're taking a vessel, they can be focal, they could be segmental. So when we take a biopsy, sometimes we have to take multiple bits and we have to take representative areas. When biopsy is impractical, then at that time we might have to do an angiography, just to see, for instance, if there is involvement of a major vessel such as aorta, or if there is a mesenteric involvement, then at that time angiography would be more useful. This is an image to show how aneurysms have occurred in a case of polyarteritis nodosa in a mesenteric vessels over here. So that's what is actually required is a strong clinical suspicion, a systematic approach to differentiate the vasculitis, and basically to define what is the organ damage which has occurred, and finally to classify them into which particular condition. But what is more important is to know the extent of involvement and which are the organs which are involved, because that would differentiate on your therapy, make a big difference into your therapy aspect. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Renuka, for that extensive presentation. I think we have time for a few questions now to from both the vasculitic topics.
I just had few comments to make. Like the second speaker, Dr. Chandrasekhar, has spoken that it is a rare disease, but it is a disease very of low prevalence or incidence, but not uncommon. And will be amazed to know that in the diagnosis of PUO nowadays, in fact vasculitis is also a PUO where we are not getting any clue, is very much prudent to include a ANA or ANCA. Secondly, in the vasculitis, wherever the normal stresses, madam, you have shown like leukocytosis. In fact, in a lot of cases of vasculitis, we are from thrombocytosis also is one of the early markers. And so far as there is some ANA and ANCA immunofluorescence are also there. Like a patient of SLE or somebody who has got a ANA 4+ homogeneous positive, if the same patient's blood is put into ANCA, sometimes the P-ANCA will come positive.
Yes, exactly. It's not just that the patient may have more often vasculitis is associated with thrombocytopenia rather than thrombocytosis. And secondly, yes, ANA positive can also have vasculitis. As I said, vasculitis, it might not be a primary vasculitis, it may be a secondary vasculitis related to some connective tissue disorder, because of which that you may have a ANA 4+. If you do an ANA profiling, maybe you would be able to detect whether it is a lupus or which other condition for which has to be thought of. So that would be the primary condition, which can also manifest as one of the manifestations would be a vasculitis. So that's what I said many a times, when you are doing a diagnostic workup, that you need to also rule out the secondary causes. Most of your diagnosis goes in ruling out the secondary causes of vasculitis.
I have a small question. A postman of middle age, is about 45 years, came to me with a history of pain in the fingers and a slight bluish discoloration and pain going on for the last about 2-3 years. And in the tip of some of the fingers, he developed small ulcers like things, and it was very painful. And there was no other symptom other than the pain, and the pain was worsening during the winter months and in the morning hours. There was no joint swelling anywhere, it was mainly the fingers, slight discoloration and small ulcer like thing. With a picture like this, how to clinically differentiate whether it is a vascular disease, peripheral vascular disease, or a vasculitis, before going into the wide gamut of the investigations which Madam described, clinically at that point of time, can you...
I have one small question before. Was it on both the sides or on one side?
It is on both the hands.
It was on both the hands. Now actually, I mean, this is more a typical of what you are talking with reference to what we commonly see with scleroderma and related diseases, like scleroderma, MCTD and so on. See, the major question that you are asking is that, is it a major vessel disease or a small vessel disease? The best simple clinical examination is check for... No, if it is a scleroderma, we would like to use a word called peripheral vascular disease or vasculopathy, because there the mechanism of those spitting and infarcts that what you are seeing is secondary to vasculopathy. It is supposed to be a reflection of a Raynaud's phenomena which causes the block and the infarcts. So a careful examination of our skin changes if any, and a careful examination of both the sides arteries, and check for counter check with the blood pressure measurement whether the blood pressure is also measurable, helps you to say whether there is a large vessel blocking. See, the same thing you can also see if there is a large vessel block further, but it is less likely, as you are saying, it is happening every winter more. It's all put us to a conclusion. Possibly it is something related to scleroderma and scleroderma related diseases, either MCTD or other Raynaud's associated diseases. So she need to be explored on that angle. More or less likely it's vasculitis. It's most probably a vasculopathy secondary to Raynaud's.
I think that lady over there wants
Hello.
to say something. Yes.
My niece has got this Churg-Strauss syndrome. Is it a lifelong disease or is there any cure for it?
The Churg-Strauss is a relatively rare disease, I understand, but it requires a lifetime management and the treatment actually. And it's quite an aggressive disease, needs to be handled with very aggressive immunosuppressive drugs.
Yes.
And there is a possibility...
She is permanently on steroids.
No, yes, you can use steroids and to be followed up by cyclophosphamide or any of those, azathioprine or some group of drugs. And the patient may go for remission, but the relapses is almost a rule. It almost happens in 50 to 60% again and again. So they almost requires a continued immunosuppression for lifetime.
So she cannot get married or have a child or anything?
Well, it's a tough question to say without seeing at the patient actually. It basically depends on how aggressive disease, how early is the disease being picked up. See, basically one important thing I think time and again whenever I speak on various autoimmune disease and even in the basics of autoimmune disease I emphasize, in the treating autoimmune disease, earlier we are at it, actually probably the chances of getting remission is higher. So it's only after seeing the patient case situations we will be able to say case by case whether patient can go for a remission. And an average, if it is a Churg-Strauss disease, the overall expected prognosis is it's only 10 to 15% we go for some sort of a remission, which is also not a long-lasting remission, and the relapse is also very high and frequent in Churg-Strauss. The basic reason most of the literature says is, since we don't diagnose it early because of the various problems that we face in making a Churg-Strauss diagnosis, that is the reason for the bad prognosis. But that's the end comment which we have. Till it is proved otherwise, we need to carry forward that message.
Regarding the diagnosis of vasculitis, the first you have to suspect clinically. After suspecting clinically, all the basic investigations you will get even in the remote areas.
Yes.
But when you come to the allied investigations like ANCA and all those things, we may not be able to get all those things in even the second cities of the state. So in those cases, with the clinical suspicion and the basic investigations, can we go ahead with the biopsy straight away?
A biopsy, if it is done and it's proven to be vasculitis, that should be adequate, is what I feel.
Actually, the biopsy is the best shortcut if you have a good histopathology interpreter there to ANCA, no doubt about it. But there is a different role that what has been of late assessed with reference to ANCA is you can prognosticate to some extent. The ANCA positive vasculitis behaves little differently from ANCA negative vasculitis, and to categorize them whether it is a Wegener's, non-Wegener's variant and those things, when you are in little difficulty, they help. Typical granulomatous vasculitis, a good histopathology specimen can be made a diagnosis that yes, this is Wegener's granulomatosis, and if you are sure you have already made a diagnosis of Wegener's granulomatosis, ANCA may not be required to make further decision on the treatment.
And regarding the site
If it is a Wegener's, then it is also useful in monitoring the disease, and the levels are important. So that's why it might be useful for you, and sometimes a very high C-ANCA level, they say it usually comes before any kind of a catastrophe comes. So that helps in monitoring. But there are varying studies regarding that actually. They have various findings.
regarding taking the biopsy, Madam told you have to take within 18 to 36 hours of the lesion. I personally feel practically it is impossible to take unless otherwise the patient is in the hospital and get the new rashes.
So that is ideally for a skin biopsy.
Yeah.
For a skin biopsy, see, because they keep getting different crops, frequently they come in crops like, so when they get a fresh lesion, then that's the best time. Suppose you have multiple lesions in on the patient, then which is the one to choose? At that time it helps you to know an earlier lesion about 18 to 36 years, that's the best one. But then yes, you can't make the patient to stay and wait for a rash to come and do it. That's not possible at all. What I mean is, when you're choosing the site, choose ideally a site which is about 18 to 36 hours old.
More than 36 hours, that is arterial fasciculitis. Whenever there is an arterial, don't please go and biopsy in 36 hours. You have to minimum give 72 hours.
Yes.
After that, if the arterial persists, then you go for the vasculitis.
Dr. Chandrasekhar again. This leukotriene antagonist, montelukast, one of the side effects is Chuck's drugs. Is there any, what is the molecular pathology, how does it, the relationship between this and leukotrienes and the Chuck's drugs? It's a rare thing clinically, but from being a rheumatologist and immunologist, you might be able to.
No, I mean, I didn't really get into the details of that, but certainly there is enough proof from the literature to say that yes, using montelukast, that leukotriene analog, antagonists, do increase the incidence of Chuk's and other musculoskeletal symptoms as well as vasculitis in wheezing patients, in asthmatic patients. I really don't know, because the prostaglandins and the leukotrienes are something which plays a lot of role. And I think Sapan has some explanation, yes.
I would just in the earlier studies which are reported with leukotriene inhibitors, and when they saw back, they were not sure whether the asthma part was severe enough to, and the eosinophilia was actually severe enough to cause the vasculitis rather than the montelukast. So that is not certain whether it is the drugs which have caused that.
The other thing is like this drug-induced vasculitis. It's I think among the vasculitis these are all lesser evils. So how often you get, what kind of advice you will give for a journalist? What kind of drugs you come up, because that is how we met. Quinoline.
Almost any drug can produce a drug-induced vasculitis. So most common is the sulfur group drugs, other is cephalosporins and few of these antibiotics. Just is withdraw the drug, no more action required, change the drugs group if the drug continuity is required. So that's a simple way to handle it. If the rashes are too much, if there is a possible renal sediment, urinary sediment, you may have to introduce steroids, which is very unusual, very rare to happen.
Thanks.
Direct immunofluorescence in the diagnosis of vasculitis.
The direct immunofluorescence, when it comes to actually except for few conditions, where there you say that in you see IgA deposits and all that. It doesn't have much of a role. That's why it's not really a must. But yes, it does have a significance when you come to skin lesions. When it comes to renal lesions, yes, it does help because we can see the immune complex deposits, and which will be useful. And like when you're doing a vaginous, you know that it is not showing, it is negative for it, ANCA is positive, and we are saying necrotizing glomerulonephritis, then immediately I can say yes. Because though I say glomerulonephritis can again have so many causes because of which it presents. So when we have to rule out each condition, that time it becomes very useful actually.
What is the cost of this cryoglobulin profile? Because we do get a lot of cases of cold urticaria. So
Cost,
is it practically feasible to?
It's not very expensive actually, but I probably what I'll do is we are planning. I've got a demand from both the consultants that we should standardize that. So I'll be doing that very shortly.
Because we do get a lot of cases of cold urticaria.
Okay.
We do get,
It's not a very expensive and not very difficult. Yes. No, but as such cryoglobulins is easily possible, yeah. It has to be, yes, and it has to be transported warm and then it has to be precipitated, yes. In a at 30, yeah, at warm. 37.
I have two doubts. Number one is, as sir asked that in case of PO, we ask for ANA. So in the absence of clinical setting, if the ANA is positive, should we go blindly for the ANA profile? How much significance we should give for ANA? Number one. And number two.
In a clinical setting, when the patient has a pyrexia of unknown origin, where you have exhausted all the possibility of a infective cause or any other cause explaining the fever, when ANA is positive, it signifies indicates that there is some pathological process is going in that direction. So now the question that remains is whether to give an importance to this ANA or not. So now the issues that remain is, now look at the ANA report, whether it is 1+, 2+, or 3+. Higher the intensity at higher dilution, probably it is more significant than a lesser intensity at a lesser dilutions. The next issue that you need to know is whether to give an importance is then you can go for ANA profiling. See, certain of the autoantibodies like antihistones, anti-single strand DNA, and the antibody to nucleosomes and anti-Jo1 in 1+, 2+ are very commonly seen in a normal population. These are the ones which are very commonly seen in normal population. Anti-Rho52 is one another which is commonly seen up to 2+. Beyond 3+, you need to give an importance to that. Double-strand DNA 3+ and above, or any such higher titers of other autoantibodies suggest probably there is an initiation of autoimmune process. See, the basic problem in all these autoimmune disease, how early we are able to catch. See, the problem is clinical criteria wise we are trying to fit in few clinical manifestations to appear, and then the autoantibodies to be positive and then make a diagnosis. There is a catch. In that, the first clinical manifestation itself is a most devastating manifestation, say like a renal involvement, then we are more into trouble. So you need to look in backwards. Have you excluded all other possibilities or mimicker of an infection or a PUO? And then is it only a pure isolated autoimmune disease process? Then look at the levels like complement levels, C3, C4 and C-reactive proteins. See, if it's an infective disease, usually CRP will be very high. It's almost, we say, 10 to 15 times fold more than the baseline cutoff. Complement levels are usually 1 to 1.5 times higher than the infective etiology. So then probably you can seriously discard the ANA, look further forward with reference to other possible infective conditions. If they are normal, take ANAs to be significant. Look backwards that is there any other findings or any other clinical features you have missed. If not, if the patient still continue to have fever, you can just brand it as undifferentiated possible autoimmune disease, questionable connective tissue disease. You can treat them with a low dose of steroids as well as NSAIDs, and you can add hydroxychloroquine and wait and watch. See, patient may develop the disease or may subside. It's a tough question to call at this point of time. Probably I am reviewing the data and information that we have gathered from last 6 years with reference to these set of patients. Maybe in your next meeting I should give you a reasonable conclusion, or otherwise we might have published this data and information, how this can be evolved or can be evaluated over a period of time in a real-time clinical setting. This is a problem. No books answer these questions because they say that if you want to make a SLE as a diagnosis, if you want to make any other connective tissue as a diagnosis, they ask you to fulfill the criteria. But in the same breath, textbook says a small terms condition apply that you can make a clinical diagnosis without fulfilling all these clinical criteria, left to the discretion of clinicians. So that's where they leave the onus on you.
I think I agree with you because when we coming to SLE, when we say we have to fulfill this as per ACR criteria, out of 11 we have to be fulfill full, but I think not necessary at a given point of time we should have all the things. So I think we should...
See the criteria wise, I think with reference to SLE and rheumatoid arthritis, it's not necessary at a point time of diagnosis. The patient can have a pleural effusion attributable to SLE 1 year before, can have a skin rashes attributable to SLE 2.5–3 years before, but they should be having those documentable manifestations over a stretch of period before making a diagnosis of SLE. That's where I said if ANA is positive, patient now have only fever, sit back with the patient and check with them, was she diagnosed to have a pleural effusion a year or 2.5 years before, treated with an antitubercular with which she got remitted. Or check with her, did she had a malar rash a couple of years before, visited a dermatologist, said probably photodermatitis, treated accordingly and patient is better after that. So in a sense, even these criteria, even if it has happened 2–3 years before, can give a diagnosis to think in possibility of SLE. Yeah.
I think now is the